don't expand our imagination.
Justification for being what you are.
I'm Chip Reid at the White House. This is Washington Unplugged. President Obama just a few minutes ago concluded his much-anticipated speech on the situation in North Africa and the Middle East, his response to the uprisings there, also touching at the end of the speech on the Middle East peace process. There was not a lot of headline news in this speech. He did call on Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to lead lead that country toward democracy or get out of the way. That's a bit stronger than anything he has said before, although other officials were saying that yesterday. He also said that he supports using the 1967 borders for proceeding with the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, something that is sure to anger the Israelis. But on the whole issue of the uprising in the Middle East, there was not a whole lot new, although he did seem to come down a bit stronger than he has in the past on the side of the protesters and certainly against the dictators who have reigned in that region for so long. I'm joined now by Juan Zarate, CBS News national security analyst. Juan, what did you think about that part of the speech, his response to the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, Chip, I think it was somewhat predictable. I think the president laid out the fact that America, with its values and its interests, will back and side with the protesters, and pretty emphatic across the board. He certainly, as you said, took the Syrians to task in a way that he had not to date, especially calling out President Assad. He also, I think, clearly laid out some priorities here, saying that Egypt and Tunisia will be examples and demonstrable examples for the region. And so we needed to concentrate attention on those countries. And I think one of the things that's new in this is he lays out an economic plan. You've heard a lot of people calling for a new Marshall Plan for the Middle East in the wake of these Arab revolutions. And so he has started down that path, talking about a multi-part program, for example, for Egypt, that the economics has to follow the political and human rights reform. So I thought that was interesting. That said, Chip, I think it has raised the same questions that you and I and others have been asking all along. At what point, for example, do we declare Syria and Iran illegitimate the way that we did with Hosni Mubarak in Egypt or Ben Ali in Tunisia? How far are we willing to go to actually support the protesters? That is a key question, and we've entered militarily in Libya, but how far are we willing to go in places like Syria or Yemen or Bahrain? And you know, how much of a U.S. role should there be when the U.S. in some ways doesn't want to be seen as a central protagonist, but is clearly a player? And so I think this was an interesting speech, one that laid out certain principles, some new factors, but I think we're left with some of the same complications that we had yesterday before the speech.
My sense in listening to the speech was at times I thought, well, he's kind of doing this to check a bunch of boxes. You know, the one thing he cannot do is simply remain silent with so much going on over there. Did you get that sense that partly this was the result of him just concluding that he had to say something?
I think that's right, Chip, and you see it in his references not only to the policies but also the anecdotes that he was using. He was using references to different voices from different capitals, and so he was in some ways trying to touch the entire region with the rhetoric that he was using. I also think that he was trying to set the stage for his meetings with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister who's coming to town, clearly laying out that there are responsibilities on both sides with the Palestinians and Israelis to try to find some ground to work. And I also think, interestingly on that, he sent a shot across the bow with respect to the Palestinians with the movement toward statehood, or the declaration of statehood at the UN in September. He was clearly sending a message here that that would not be productive and that the U.S. would not support that, that there's an alternate way of achieving true independence. And so I thought that was interesting. One other quick point, Chip, you know, I come from the Bush administration, and I just have to note that this sounded an awful lot in principle like Bush's second inaugural address, where he declared the end of tyranny, or at least the end of tyranny being a chief American goal, and the untamed fires of freedom reaching the darkest corners of the world. This sounded an awful lot like that, and so I just found that to be an interesting parallel.
What did you think about his very clear statement in support of the 1967 borders as a starting point in Middle East negotiations rather than something that might be reached eventually.
You raise that. It's a very interesting point here. I think one of the things that the president's trying to do is he's trying to move the process forward materially. And so I think by putting that out there, he puts at least a marker down, forcing a reaction from both Israel and the Palestinians. It demonstrates at least an attempt to lay down some elements of an architecture for negotiations and next steps. The challenge for him, though, is there have been calls for the president to lay down a master plan or the final resolution of this, and he's been unwilling to do that. And he took some baby steps in that direction to try to push the parties, but I don't think it's going to necessarily dislodge the impasse we're at.
You know, the president has argued forcefully a number of times that he gave the Middle East peace process the kind of attention that previous administrations, in particular the one you worked for, did not. But he also seemed and has seemed at many points along the way very frustrated that he may be giving it time, but he doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. Do you have that? Do you sense that same frustration?
I think there's supreme frustration on that front, and in particular with Senator Mitchell, George Mitchell, the peace envoy's resignation and final day, I think tomorrow. Really a symbolic end to the push and the attempt by the Obama administration to seek peace. I think in retrospect we'll all see not only the efforts to have failed, at least in this period, but I think the attempts to really push the Israelis publicly on the settlement issue as being a strategic failure and a real kind of missed opportunity at the start of the Obama administration. So I think there is frustration on that front, and I think there is real concern that not only is the Arab Spring sort of bringing the region into tumult, but that it may consume Israel in some way, and we may be seeing a diplomatic showdown in New York in September when the Palestinians push for recognition as a state.
Very good point. One last question on the Arab Spring issue. Certainly he did have a lot of very strong rhetoric on behalf of and in favor of the people who are out there in the streets protesting, but he also seemed to give himself a nice big loophole there for places like Bahrain.
You know, clearly he directed his attention to the principles that we're supporting, but I think he, as has been consistent with his statements and Secretary Clinton's statements, are looking at each country case by case, and you see in the language that he used for the different countries that very wiggle room that you described, allowing a bit of leeway in terms of the pace of reform and how hard we push the leadership. We want to be harsher, I think, with countries like Iran and Syria, and I think the language will start to follow in that regard. We want to be a little bit gentler with allies like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and others who are longstanding allies and where we need them for stability in the region.
Juan, I lied. I have one more question.
As many as you want.
On the issue of Bashar al-Assad, the White House has been saying that the decision to impose those sanctions, which came down yesterday, was a coincidence, a timing coincidence. Had nothing to do with the fact that the speech was today. Do you buy that?
I don't buy that wholly because I've worked, I was an assistant secretary in the Treasury. I know how this works. It takes time to get them together, no doubt. You've got to put the material together. They have to be legally defensible, reviewed by lawyers. But no doubt they were working on this very hard since the prior designations where the administration was criticized roundly for not having named President Assad, and in concert with the growing violence that they were witnessing. And so this was happening, and no doubt there was pressure on the Treasury to get this done in time for this speech. All of this is orchestrated. And, you know, to their credit, it's something the president can point to. The one thing I would say, though, Chip, and they still haven't answered this question, is at what point do we declare President Assad as illegitimate? Right. The way we did with our ally, President Mubarak in Cairo, our ally Ben Ali in Tunisia, and we've done, obviously, with Gaddafi with military intervention. At what point is too much, and what's the tipping point before we declare that they're illegitimate and we need regime change?
Well, thank you very much, Juan Zarate, our crackerjack and incredibly well-informed CBS News national security analyst. And stay tuned this evening for the CBS Evening News. Katie Couric will have an interview with Hillary Rodham Clinton, the Secretary of State, her response to this speech today. That's Washington Unplugged. Thanks for joining us, and please join us again.
If we don't expand our imagination,
justification for being what